When Katerina Weber, 31, drove her shiny red Porsche 911 into the Muller garage in the heart of Munich with a problem that no one seemed to understand, the men present reacted in two ways. Some looked at her with the morbid desire of those who only see a beautiful body and money to exploit. Others with the annoyance of those who have no patience for a woman who gestured desperately without uttering a comprehensible word. No one understood that she was deaf. No one bothered to try to understand her. No one except Lucas Becker, 29 years old, a mechanic with oil-smeared hands and a bank account that barely lasted until the end of the month, who looked past the designer dress and the expensive car and simply saw a person who needed help. What happened next, what Lucas did in the following weeks, would become legendary throughout Munich. Because sometimes the real luxury is not what you can buy, but what someone is willing to sacrifice to make you feel seen in a world that has stopped looking. And this is the story of how a poor mechanic with a heart of gold did the impossible for a woman whom the world treated as invisible, despite all her wealth. If you're ready for this story, right where you're watching this video. The Mueller workshop was one of those places where time seemed to have stood still in the 1970s. Walls covered in grease stains from decades of use, concrete floors scarred by 1,000 repairs. The air smelled of burnt rubber and motor oil. It was run by Hans Muller, a 60-year-old man with a belly and worker's hands who had spent more time under cars than with his own family. Lucas Becker was the youngest on the team. He had started as an apprentice at 16 when he had to leave school to help his sick mother pay the bills after his father left them penniless. He had learned the trade with almost religious devotion and, despite his young age, had become the best technician in the workshop. His hands were magical with engines, able to diagnose problems that others didn't see. But his real talent was something else. He knew how to listen. Not just engines, but people. On that Tuesday afternoon in September, Lucas was working under a Fiat when he heard the unmistakable sound of a powerful engine pulling into the workshop yard. He crawled out from under the car, wiped his hands on his dirty blue smock, and caught his breath. A fiery red Porsche 911 stood in the dusty workshop yard, as out of place as a diamond in a pile of rocks. It was a car that cost more than Lucas would earn in 10 lifetimes. And out of the driver's door stepped a woman who seemed even more out of place than the car itself. She was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with long blonde hair tied back in an elegant ponytail. She wore a wine-red dress that probably cost as much as Lucas's annual rent, dizzying heels that clicked on the concrete, and sunglasses that hid half her face. She had the refined beauty of women born with money, where every detail was perfectly manicured. The other mechanics had all stopped looking. Stefan, the oldest after Hans, had whistled vulgarly. Thomas and Andreas had laughed. Lucas felt his stomach tighten with vicarious embarrassment. The woman had taken off her sunglasses, revealing bright green eyes that nervously scanned the surroundings. She had approached the group of men with uncertain steps, as if entering enemy territory. And then she had started gesturing. Her hands moved quickly in the air, forming signs that Lucas did not understand, but which clearly had meaning for her. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were trying to form words, but no intelligible sound came out, only guttural, inarticulate noises. Hans had looked at her with growing irritation and asked her in an increasingly loud voice what she wanted, as if shouting would help. She had continued to gesticulate desperately, pointing to the Porsche, then to the hood, then making gestures that seemed to refer to the engine. Stefan had laughed openly and said that if she had enough money for the car, she could afford to go to the Porsche dealer instead of wasting her time. Andreas added a sexist comment about how women didn't understand cars and she probably just needed gas. Lucas had seen the humiliation on the woman's face. Her cheeks reddened, her eyes filled with restrained tears, her hands trembled as she desperately continued to try to communicate. And in that moment, he understood something the others didn't see. She was deaf. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. All those gestures weren't nervousness or oddity, it was sign language. And she wasn't speaking because she couldn't or had never learned. She was deaf, probably from birth, and had found herself in a hostile environment full of men who treated her like an idiot instead of trying to help. Lucas stepped forward and walked toward her while the others continued to laugh and comment. He stopped in front of her, waited until she looked him in the eye, and then did the only thing he could think of. He took his phone out of his pocket, opened the Notes app, and typed, "Are you deaf?" He turned it toward her. The woman read it, and her eyes widened. She nodded frantically, such pure relief on her face that it was almost painful to watch. Finally, someone understood. Lucas continued typing. What's wrong with the car? She took out her own cell phone, a latest generation iPhone in an expensive leather case, and typed quickly. The engine was making strange noises, overheating, and the oil warning light was on. She was afraid to drive to Berlin, where she lived. Lucas read it, then looked up at her and smiled. A genuine, friendly smile that said, I'll help you. And he saw something change in her face. The tension slipped from her shoulders, the tears stopped. She returned the smile with one so radiant that Lucas forgot to breathe for a moment. Hans had intervened harshly and asked what Lucas was doing. They had other customers waiting. But for the first time in 10 years of work, Lucas answered his boss. He explained that the lady was deaf, had a real problem with her car, and he was going to help her. Hans muttered something about being too kind-hearted, but nodded that he could continue. The other mechanics shook their heads and returned to their work, leaving Lucas with the mysterious woman and her impossible Porsche. Lucas led her to the car and motioned for her to open the hood. When she did, he leaned over to examine the engine. It didn't take long to find the problem. A significant oil leak, a damaged hose, and what looked like the beginning of engine overheating, repairable but time-consuming and requiring special parts for a Porsche. He took out his cell phone and wrote, serious problem but repairable. Needs special parts. 2 or 3 days. Expensive. She read it and replied immediately. How much will it cost? Lucas did a quick calculation and wrote a sum that he knew was honest but high. She didn't even blink, just nodded and wrote, okay, when can I pick it up? They exchanged information. Lucas gave her the number of the repair shop and his personal number. He wrote that he would call her with updates. She wrote that she preferred text messages for obvious reasons, and Lucas felt stupid for not realizing that himself. Before she left, the woman did something Lucas didn't expect. She took his oil-smeared hand, which he was about to pull away embarrassedly, and squeezed it tightly. Then she tapped on her cell phone. Thank you for seeing me. 4 simple words that hit Lucas harder than he would have thought possible. Thank you for seeing me. Not for the car repair, not for the kindness, but for seeing her as a person, as a human being who deserved respect and understanding. She drove away in a taxi, leaving the Porsche in the repair shop, and Lucas stayed there staring at his cell phone where he had saved her number under the name she had given him, Katerina. That evening, when he returned to his small apartment on the outskirts of town, where he lived with his mother, Lucas couldn't get Katerina out of his mind. He thought about what her life must be like, navigating a world made for hearing people when you couldn't hear. He thought about the humiliation she had suffered in the workshop and probably suffered constantly. He thought about those green eyes full of gratitude for the minimum of human decency. And that night, while his mother slept in the next room, Lucas took his old laptop and started searching. He searched for Learn German Sign Language. He found videos on YouTube, apps, online guides, and he began to study. Because Lucas Backer, 29 years old, a mechanic with dirty hands and modest dreams, had decided to do something that no one expected of him. He decided to learn an entire language just to be able to talk to a woman he had met for 10 minutes. Not because she was rich, not because she was beautiful, but because for the first time in a long time, he had seen someone who needed to be seen just as he did. Over the next few days, Lucas worked on the Porsche during the day and studied at night. He had searched for German Sign Language and found videos, apps, and online guides. Learning DJs turned out to be more difficult than expected. It wasn't just a matter of memorizing signs, but of understanding a completely different grammar. His fingers, so skilled with wrenches, were clumsy at forming signs. But Lucas was stubborn. Katerina sent messages every evening asking for updates. Lucas replied with technical details. The conversations were formal, but there was something beneath the surface, a mutual curiosity that neither dared to express. On the 4th day, the Porsche was ready. Lucas spent the night obsessively repeating the basic signs. When Katerina arrived on Friday, she seemed more relaxed. J, blouse, less makeup. She smiled warmly at him. Lucas showed her the repairs on his cell phone. She asked intelligent questions that showed how much she knew about cars. When it was time to pay, Lucas did something before leaving that surprised her. He raised his hands and signed with slow, uncertain movements. "Thank you for your patience." Katerina froze. Her eyes filled with tears. She wrote on her cell phone and swore, "Did you learn DGS? For me?" Lucas nodded, his face red. He wrote, "Just a little. I wanted to be able to talk to you. I'm sorry if it's terrible." Katerina wrote with trembling fingers, "No one has ever done anything like this for me. No one." They looked at each other in the noisy workshop courtyard, isolated in their small, quiet world. Then she took his hand, placed it on her throat, and slowly signed until he understood. "I want to teach you." Lucas nodded. His heart was beating very loudly. The sign language lessons became something deeper. Katerina came to the workshop twice a week and sat in Hans's dusty office to teach Lucas with infinite patience. Through these gestures, Lucas discovered her story. Do you like this story? Give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. Katharina was born deaf into a wealthy Munich family. Her father, Friedrich Weber, had built a real estate empire from nothing. Instead of learning sign language, he had sent her to the best speech therapists and desperately tried to make her normal. She had learned to read lips, to hide her deafness, to pretend. Her father had seen deafness as a flaw that had to be hidden. She had grown up lonely, even when surrounded by people, invisible, even though she was always being watched. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving her a fortune but no real emotional connection. She managed the family real estate and navigated meetings where everyone talked around her, never with her. Lucas told her his story in return. A poor childhood, a father who left her, a sick mother, abandoned dreams. For Katerina, it was not failure, but privilege. She, who had always had too much, saw the richness in what he gave. Sacrifice, unconditional love, dignity and honest work. Slowly, inevitably, something blossomed between them when Lucas gestured and Katerina laughed softly, when she gently corrected his mistakes and he blushed when their eyes met and lingered too long. Colleagues began to comment. Hans teased him about his crush on the princess. Stefan made vulgar comments. Lucas ignored everything and protected what he was building with her. 2 months after their first meeting, Lucas plucked up his courage. He signed awkwardly. "May I invite you to dinner?" Katerina signed. "Do you know what that means? In my circles, our worlds." Lucas took her hands. He signed tremulously. "I know exactly what it means, and I don't care." The smile she gave him was worth every consequence. Their first dinner was at a small trattoria in Lucas Vier. She came in jeans and a sweater without jewelry and finally seemed free. They communicated in sign language and glances that said more than 1,000 words. After dinner, they went for a walk, and in a quiet alley, Lucas finally kissed her. His hands were still signing when their lips met. The following months were the happiest either of them had ever known. Lucas took her into his world, picnics, movies with subtitles, visits to his mother, who immediately loved Katerina. But when she took him into her world, everything changed. At a private art exhibition, the looks were curious and contemptuous. Who was this man in the worn suit? People saw his oil-stained hands and measured his worth in euros. Worse still, when they discovered that Katerina was deaf and Lucas signed with her, they rejected them even more instead of integrating them. They talked over her, treating Lucas like an interpreter instead of a partner. Katerina's mother discovered the relationship. She called her daughter in and asked if she had lost her mind. A mechanic, a poor nobody. Katerina defended Lucas fiercely, but her mother's words planted seeds of doubt. Was she dragging Lucas into a world that would always reject him? Lucas felt the growing distance. One night, after another difficult dinner, he stopped her on the street. He signed. "Do you think I'm not good enough for you?" Katerina shook her head. Tears ran down her cheeks. She signed. "I think you're too good for me. Too good for this world that judges you. I don't want you to suffer because of me." Lucas took her hands. He signed. "Love is worth the suffering. You are worth everything." They hugged on the street while passers-by looked at them. But this time, neither of them cared. The breaking point came 3 months later. Katerina's mother organized a family dinner, supposedly to make peace. But when Lucas arrived and met the other guest, Marcus Schneider, a successful lawyer and son of a wealthy family, he realized it was a trap. The dinner was surreal. Katerina's mother ignored Lucas as if he were invisible and constantly turned to Marcus. Marcus spoke to Katharina with the condescension that nice people use with disabled people, too slowly and too loudly. Lucas saw Katharina shrink and become quiet, submissive, invisible again, and something inside him broke. When her mother made another comment about how Marcus would be a more suitable partner, Lucas stood up. All eyes turned to him, and he did something completely crazy. He began to sign, not to Katharina, but to her family, even though he knew they wouldn't understand. He signed about how blind they were not to see their daughter's greatness, how strong she was to have survived in a family that treated her as defective, how brave she was. He turned to Katharina and signed out, "You are perfect, and if you can't see that, you are deaf, not her." Then he ran to the bus stop, his heart pounding, unsure whether he had saved everything or destroyed it. 10 minutes later, Katharina caught up with him, running down the street, still in her elegant dress and hat. Her eyes were red, but she smiled brightly. She signed with trembling hands. "I told my mother that if she has to choose, she chooses you. Always you." Lucas took her in his arms on the street. He had learned a whole language for her. She had chosen him above all else. Maybe their love was crazy. Maybe the world would never understand it. But they understood each other, and that was all that mattered. A year later, the Muller workshop had a new sign. It was now called Werkstatt Muller-Weber, and a modern new building had been constructed next to the old dusty garage. It was not just a workshop, but a training center for young deaf people, the first of its kind in all of Bavaria. It had been Katharina's project, financed by her inheritance, but inspired by Lucas. She wanted to create a place where people like them could learn practical trades, where deafness was seen not as a handicap, but as a characteristic. Lucas had become the head instructor and taught mechanics in a language he now spoke fluently. Their wedding had been small and perfect, not a grand ceremony in one of Munich's elegant churches. Instead, they had married in a public garden with Lucas's mother as maid of honor and a DGS interpreter who translated the vows for hearing guests. Katharina's mother had not come, but her brother had, and that had been enough. Hans had retired and placed the workshop in Lucas's capable hands, who now ran both businesses with surprising efficiency. Business was better than ever, not only because the deaf community had finally found a workshop where they were understood, but because the story of Lucas and Katharina had become a local legend. The tabloid press had tried to turn it into a soap opera, The Millionaire and the Mechanic. But anyone who really knew their story knew it was no fairy tale. It was a true story of two people who found each other when they both needed it most. Katharina had turned her isolation into a mission. She had launched accessibility campaigns, used her wealth and connections to change laws, open conversations, make the world a slightly better place for deaf people. She was no longer invisible by choice or shame. She was visible because she chose to be seen, on her own terms. Lucas hadn't turned into a millionaire in designer clothes. He was still the guy with dirty hands and a pure heart who woke up early to check on his mother before going to work, who ate at the same cheap trattoria he had always loved. But now he had something worth more than all the money in the world, a partner who saw and loved him for exactly who he was. They had bought a house together, not in Katharina's family villa and not in Lucas's apartment on the outskirts, but something in between. A modest house in a normal neighborhood where neighbors brought them welcome cakes and didn't care how much they earned. In this house, they sat on the sofa every evening and talked. Lucas signed stories about his day, people he met, engines he repaired. Katharina signed her plans for the foundation, battles she fought, small triumphs and big frustrations. And in those moments, in the silence of their home, filled with the language of their hands, they were perfectly happy. Katharina's mother had finally gotten in touch, not with apologies, but with quiet acceptance. She came to visit, saw the training center, saw how deaf people flourished under the guidance of her daughter and Lucas. She had never learned sign language, but she had learned to respect those who had. 2 years after their wedding, Katharina and Lucas had a daughter. She was born hearing, but they created a bilingual environment for her and taught her both spoken German and DGS from birth. She grew up knowing that communication takes many forms, that people have value regardless of their abilities, that love is the most important thing. They named her Emma, And by the time she was 3 years old, she was already fluent in sign language and translated between her grandmother Weber and her mother with an ease that made both parents smile. Years later, when Lucas was interviewed for an article about successful social entrepreneurs, they asked him what had motivated him to learn sign language in the first place. He smiled and gave a simple but true answer. He said he saw someone who needed to be understood and did the only thing that made sense. He learned to speak her language, not out of pity or to impress, but because when you love someone, you learn to communicate in the ways they need, not just the ways that are convenient. And Katerina, who read the article later, cried not tears of sadness, but of deep gratitude. Gratitude for that day when a broken Porsche led her to a dirty repair shop where a young mechanic saw her when everyone else looked right through her. Because sometimes the real luxury isn't what you can buy with money. It is finding someone who is willing to learn an entire language just to get to know you. It is being loved not in spite of who you are, but precisely because of who you are. It is building a world together where you can both be seen, heard, and understood. And in the reverent silence of their home, Lucas and Katerina reminded themselves every evening how happy they were, not because of money or success or material things, but for having found each other in a world that had tried to keep them apart, for having chosen love when everything said it was impossible, for having built something beautiful from the ashes of judgment and misunderstanding. Their love needed no words spoken aloud. It spoke perfectly in the language of hands, in the language of sacrifice, in the universal language of two people who truly see each other and choose to stay, day after day, in a noisy world that had finally learned to listen to their eloquent silence. If this story makes you believe that true love conquers all barriers, leave a little heart below. And if you really want to support stories like this, which remind us of the value of kindness and understanding in a world that often forgets, you can leave a heartfelt thank you using the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Lucas's decision to learn a language just to see Katharina smile because you stayed until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonist of this story. T.